499 1000. You're listening to me, Mike Graham, right here on the home of common sense. It is, of course, Talk Radio.
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio.
Now, time to say a very, very good morning to Helen Dale, writer, lawyer, political commentator, and somebody who used to suffer from dyslexia, apparently. Helen, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm quite enjoying the old dust up with the French, because the great thing about it is that it never really comes... It's so very French. It is. It doesn't really ever come to anything. I was expecting to see pictures of them hurling, brie at the English warships, because that's the kind of thing they do.
I'm waiting for a flotilla of French fishing boats to come up the Thames and then deposit some rotting fish outside the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, or maybe sneakily get across London and deposit their rotting fish outside the Palace of Westminster.
Oh, quite.
A little bit of France comes to Blighty.
If you remember the Brexit fisherman dispute way back when the fishermen came up the Thames, I've already been sent the picture of Bob Geldof, who decided to take it upon himself to give them the two-fingered salute. So somebody's already sent that out, saying, here he is, the leader of the French fishermen from Brittany. But I mean, it is kind of, it's the sort of thing that fills you with joy in a way, because
it's
as you say,
funny.
it is quite funny.
It is quite funny. It's deeply French. And the thing is, these two industries, so fisheries and agriculture, so you've got the historic background radiation provided by the Common Agricultural Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy. And they were designed, Vernon Bogdanall's written about this, and I've reviewed his most recent book for CapX on it. They were very much designed, those policies were to protect French farmers, particularly small French farmers and small French fishermen. And this is something that is not just Brexit related. I mean, you used to, when you studied European law at university, I remember studying this at university, you would get cases where there were intra-EU disputes over this. And there was one case that I remember studying, and it was called the Spanish strawberries case. So when you were writing about it in your EU law exam, you had to, instead of putting the actual official name up, because they're not named in such a way that is easy to recall, you summarise the facts in the name of the case. So we would all call it, the law students would all call it the Spanish strawberries case. And that involved French hauliers stopping Spanish strawberries at the French-Spanish border. And this is from another EU country, and either setting them on fire, rolling them over, or in some other way destroying the produce inside them. It was just extraordinary and just deeply, deeply French.
Yes.
This is just what they do.
They love a fire. I mean, they do like setting fire to tyres quite a bit as well. And they also love going on strike. I mean, it's what you expect. I mean, I've never forgotten my honeymoon in France, where there was literally nothing to do on a Monday because nothing was open. Everybody just shut down. And most of August, Paris is mostly closed because they just they all
there
head
are
off
only
down
tourists.
the Rue de Soleil and head to the south, du Sud. And it's a remarkable country, really.
I mean, I love France. I love the French. I mean, but I always go, whenever I go to France, and I speak fairly good French, although not good enough for Parisians, and I tend to find I have the problem of I'll sit there and I'll be reading a French newspaper, and then someone will come up to me and speak to me in French because they assume, French speaker, she's reading a French paper.
Right.
And then I respond with my terrible accent. My accent is atrocious. And they just pull this awful expression, sort of, how very dare you
very
be able to read our newspapers, but you sound like you come from Nice.
Yes.
That's basically, I was taught by someone from southern France.
Yes.
So I've got
which brings us to a rather nicely a piece of information that you imparted just recently, that you were, as you were growing up, you discovered that you were dyslexic. And I think it's an interesting conversation to have, because many people that I speak to tell me that they've either got children who are suffering from a mild form of dyslexia or dyspraxia or something like that. So it's something that a lot of people have to deal with. How was your experience, and how did you sort of overcome it, if you like?
Well, the piece that I've written, which Mike has for people who are listening, was published by Law and Liberty. It's an American magazine where I'm a staff writer. They call them senior writers in America, and I have to write one long feature a month for them. And that was this was actually the April feature, but for some reason it ran in the beginning of May, probably to do with me being slow. But anyway, the piece is actually about IQ and the fact that it's mostly heritable. In other words, if you're very clever, you get it from your mum and dad. You're not a special snowflake. It's like I got green eyes from my mother and curly hair from my father. You know, you inherit it in much the same way.
Right.
And so a lot of people don't want to hear that. But one of the ways dyslexia used to be diagnosed, I don't know whether it still is, but it was certainly in the 70s when I was diagnosed with it, was that a child underperformed their IQ. So basically, you would be given an IQ test if dyslexia was suspected. And if your IQ was very high, and yet you were at the bottom of the class in everything, but particularly in reading, then that was often a sign that the kid was dyslexic. There were other things that they checked as well. I was checked for letter reversals. That's another standard thing. You just flip your letters around. This seeming inability to learn to read, yet I was quite good at maths, and I've lost them now, but I remember when I was sort of a teenager looking at my primary school reports from year 1 and year 2, and the maths was all fine, and Helen can't read, and it turned out for me, this was very important for me, and it'd be interesting if you got someone like Catherine Burblesing or Tom Bennett in here, educators, to talk about this, or Calvin Robinson. For me, what had to happen was I had to be taught to read using the phonics method.
Right.
I couldn't be taught to read using the method that was popular in the 70s. Remember, this is in Queensland in Australia. Other countries, no doubt, did very different things. It was called the look-say method, or the whole word method, where you were taught an entire word. That didn't work for me. I had to have it broken up into syllables.
Right. Okay.
And
so you didn't have any trouble reading numbers then? Because some dyslexics can't read numbers either. It's a question of what order they see things in, isn't it?
Yeah, my understanding is that when you have difficulties with and remember, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm someone who's dyslexic, but I'm not an expert in it. I know what worked for me, and I have read, obviously, because you get interested in it. And what it led to for me was, in the 70s and 80s, when it was being treated, is dyslexics are regularly IQ tested. So I probably had half a dozen IQ tests in primary school. And then, because there's then an educational record for you, in my case, I then had another IQ test just before I went up.
Right. And did they all come out the same way, the IQ tests?
I can't remember the numbers from when I was a kid, but the two most recent ones did. Right. I had one that just before I went up, and then I had another one that was actually taken at Oxford I think that I had to ride over from my college to the science parks. And not only did they do the test, but I had to sit there while I was doing the IQ test with these little electrodes attached to my head with this sort of gooey stuff.
Right.
And there was this machine behind me working out basically how I processed information. And both those two tests came out with the same number, 148.
Okay.
But they were an adult test, and you use different tests for different ages.
Yeah, no, the only reason I ask is because it was fascinating to me, exactly how they measure it, and whether every time they do a test, it measures the same number, because presumably the number should be the same.
Well, yes, and there is an expression that psychologists and statisticians and psychiatrists use when they talk about this. They talk about someone's IQ stabilizing. Yeah. And it becomes more, and for most people, obviously there are exceptions to this, but it becomes more and more stable as a person gets older. So mine, by the time I was first an older teenager and then in my 20s, by that time my IQ had completely stabilized, and I have no desire to get another test because I know it will come out within 1 point. It will be the same, and that's basically meaningless. But and there's also the two books that I read to feed into that piece, but I read quite a lot of other scientific papers. I shamelessly abuse this facility known as Sci-Hub, which allows you to get academic papers without having to pay for them. But so that I could do a bit of extra reading. This was the first one. It's called The Bell Curve. And as I warn in the piece, it was by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. Now, they're Americans. It's mainly about America. And there are things in it, like the last part of it's all these policy proposals, which if you show them to a British person, regardless of their politics, the response would be, well, that's bonkers. We're not doing that here. don't copy the Americans on policy, they can't do it. But ignoring that, the rest of the book is very, very interesting. But it is, because it's basically a summary of IQ research to date.
Yeah.
As I say in my piece, it is 600 plus pages printed on Bible paper. It took me a while to read.
Yes. Useful doorstop material, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. So what I finished up doing in order to get more recent information and also to download more recent papers and read more widely was get this little book by a chap called Stuart Ritchie, and it's just Intelligence, All That Matters.
Right.
And it's tiny and it's inexpensive. So that helps as well, rather than the big.
That is much better, yes. I like
also,
that much better.
Yeah, the virtue of the Stuart Ritchie book is that it was published in 2015, whereas the Bell Curve came out in 1994. So there are things in the Bell Curve where they're cheerfully saying, oh, we don't know about this, we don't know about that. Whereas once you get to the 2015 book by Stuart Ritchie, you find that things that people didn't know or they weren't sure one way or the other have been shown to be true or false or whatever, which is actually very helpful. And then the other thing Ritchie does is gives you this terrific bibliography at the back and lists of papers and things that you can go and read yourself.
So what is his conclusion about intelligence, if that's not too simplification for you?
Well, the basic guts of it is summarised very nicely on the back of Ritchie's book, where the research shows that intelligence test scores are meaningful, that they relate to education, occupation, and even health, that they are genetically influenced, and that they are linked to measures of the brain, including the size of it. Now, obviously, this is a size relative to your population, relative to the size of your body. As Ritchie points out in the book, elephants have much bigger brains than human beings do, but then elephants are enormous. And yes, elephants are very clever. They are sociable, they have memory, they seem to mourn their dead, all of that. We all talk about memory like an elephant, and there's a reason for that. But they're not going to be putting somebody on the moon anytime soon.
No. Maybe it's just because they don't want to.
Well, that's the Douglas Adams argument with dolphins. They're far too busy playing around in the water having fun.
Why bother going to work if you don't actually have to? But that's
if you don't actually have to.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, this is interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, I would like to sort of switch this conversation into the academic world, which you've also been talking about this week, where you go, it's all very well, all these intelligent people arguing with each other about things, but if they don't actually use that intelligence to be intelligent, then what's the point? Would be my argument.
Is a thing, and it's exactly this particular issue that the Bell Curve and the and Intelligence, All That Matters start to bring up, is that it has become very difficult over the last few years to do research in this area. And the danger is, if you do research in this area and publish in it, you'll get cancelled. And the most egregious, in the piece that I wrote for The Critic, which is also up on my Twitter feed, and I think you may have retweeted it, but I can tweet it again afterwards. It's quite short. It's on a new publication called the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And that is a standard academic journal, like a chemistry, if you went and got something on chemistry or on biology or medicine or law or whatever. It's an academic journal in the traditional sense. You send your papers in, they get peer reviewed and so on and so forth. But what they allow you to do at the Journal of Controversial Ideas is, if you're really worried that you'll get cancelled, you're allowed to publish your paper anonymously. It still has to go through the full formal peer review process and has to be good science, basically. So that's the first thing. And 3 of the papers in the first issue have the scholars have taken that option. The other thing that they guarantee you is, if you do put a controversial paper into the journal and they accept it for publication and it's peer reviewed in the proper way, and it becomes the subject of a Twitter storm, basically, because that's what it is. It's Twitter storm. the journal guarantees to have your back and not retract the paper unless it's for the traditional reasons that you retract a paper,
and
which
to
is,
not
it doesn't,
presumably reveal the name of the author. But of course,
if they're the anonymous ones, but not
Yeah.
all of them are anonymous. Only some of them are.
Right, because the difficulty with all of that is it's fine for them to stand by you and to have your back until such time as then the crazed mob comes after the publication itself, and that's when things start to get tricky, isn't it? Because that's what we've seen so many times with people being cancelled, with academics being refused, chairs at universities, with academics and other speakers being refused entry to different universities because it's the university that then loses its nerve and says, well, we can't really put up with all of this criticism, so we're going to just have to cancel that and we won't do it anymore.
Well, this is one of the things that there's an editorial, because it's the first issue, the first number one, basically, of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. They talk about there's the phenomenon, there's a series of interrelated phenomena here. There's the post hoc fake peer review of people's papers on Twitter. There's the brigading and dogpiling of academics across a number of areas, and it's not politically based. Some of them are left-wing, some of them are right-wing. They've just managed to do something that irritates a lot of people. So there's that. And then there's the use of open letters and petitions. And I actually spoke to Francesca Minerva, who's one of the co-editors of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And she made the point to me, she said, I don't have a problem with people signing petitions if they really dislike an area of scholarship. My problem is with the universities going weak at the knees and then sacking the scholar who's done the research.
And effectively closing off that particular avenue of exploration so that you're not even allowed to go there.
And this is what has happened, not in all areas of it, but in some areas, in quite a serious way, with research into intelligence, because it just touches a nerve that's been raw since man walked on two legs, or certainly raw since Christianity and Islam first emerged into the world, because they're both religions that have, as weird as it sounds to us now, very, very clear ideas about the idea of human equality. In Islam, it's more male equality and less good for women. But even at the time when Muhammad was coming up with those ideas, the idea that to suggest in some way or form that all men are equal was an extremely radical idea. And in Christianity, it was men and women as well, although the status of women there also was a bit lower. All the other civilizations, including great civilizations like the historic Chinese civilization and the Romans, in which Christianity first emerged, accepted that human beings were unequal.
Yeah.
They accepted that some were cleverer than others, that some were sportier than others, that some were better looking than others. And there's an incident in a Roman court case, for example, where a woman was on trial for murder and she was absolutely gorgeous. And this was, the Romans later had women on juries. This was quite in their early history. And and they had 15 jurors, like in Scotland, so different legal system.
Yeah.
And it was an all-male jury. And she just got up in the dock and dropped her clothes.
You can't do that these days.
No, you can't do that now. The CPS might take a dim view of it. But in what she was doing, she was making an argument that made sense to a Roman, which is that if you were clever or brave or beautiful, that meant that you were blessed by the gods and a better person.
Yes.
So one of the reasons why there is this awful fight over IQ research, although it's now starting to spread into sporting research with the transgender issue and men and women sharing athletic events and so on and so forth, so even sport is not safe, is because we're terrified that we're going to find out that, well, not only are people radically unequal on an individual basis, but that there are average differences between groups, and that all of those differences are inherited, which means no matter how many trillions of pounds we spend on trying to improve the lot of people who come at the bottom of the educational totem pole,
or to homogenise everybody, in another way of putting it.
We're not going to be able to do it. It's not going to be possible.
Although I suppose the ideologues would say just because you can't do it doesn't mean you shouldn't try, does it?
Well, a lot of people do say that, but it does become, and this is where we get back to the dyslexia point again. I was one of the lucky dyslexics with a high IQ, which meant that the dyslexia was very obvious. here was this kid with this very high IQ who couldn't read.
Right.
And also the social class advantage. My parents paid for my phonics tutor themselves. So if you have people who here it's poverty, from poor backgrounds, whose kid is clever but dyslexic and can't afford to pay for a tutor, whether it's in phonics or in some other area, then you've got a class issue, which is some of the stuff that the Sewell report identified.
Yeah.
Everyone wanted them to talk about race, but they got up and they finished up talking about social class. So you've got all sorts of really complex and difficult and challenging things in our faces that we don't want to acknowledge. But the way to respond to these complex and difficult things is to let the scholars do the research and
Absolutely.
see what falls out of that.
Right.
You should not have a situation where you have to found a special academic journal so that scholars can publish anonymously so they don't get cancelled in an important area of scholarly research.
Well,
And
perhaps
the
it's
danger...
Perhaps it's another area then that the government should get involved in, because after all, they've just announced, have they not, this week, that Neil O'Brien is the new levelling up minister, and this seems to me to be a perfect example of what levelling up should be about.
Levelling up, it absolutely is. And the thing is, the only way we can get anywhere with it, things that are true, is by staring them in the face. And the last paragraph of my Law and Liberty piece, I'm a novelist. I wrote 2 novels about a civilization that does engage in eugenics. That's what Kingdom of the Wicked is about in many ways, because it's based on Roman morality, and the Romans did not care.
And that was why it was so controversial. We got to wrap this up though, Helen. So I'm afraid I have to ask you to be very quick here.
So what happens if we don't do this research and the Chinese do? Think about that. And think about how China has behaved during the pandemic.
Yes.
That's my closing warning.
Okay. Well, it's a good one. Helen, thank you very much indeed. Helen Dale there with her take on the week. Some very interesting points that she's talked about. Many of you reacting to the dyslexia